This is the crested gecko, one of the most popular pet reptiles in the world, but it hasn't always been this way. Coming from the remote Pacific island of New Caledonia, these geckos were poorly studied in the wild and hadn't been officially recorded for over a century, leading many scientists to believe they were extinct. It is therefore no wonder there still remains very little information about the wild habitats and behaviours of these enigmatic geckos. So, in March 2024, we aim to change that by venturing across the planet to find these iconic reptiles in the wild. Corallophus ciliatus was described by French zoologist Alphonse Grouchenot in 1866. The specimens were retrieved from New Caledonia, and then the species fell into obscurity, seemingly disappearing from science. It wasn't until 1994 when a single specimen was rediscovered on the Isle of Pines off the south coast of New Caledonia that scientists realised the species had been living in several small, isolated populations away from the eyes of science. In 1993, one day after a tropical storm, a single specimen was found by a resident on the Isle of Pines and given to Orstom, the scientific governing body for French overseas territories at the time, for analysis. Herpetologist Wilhelm Henkel then visited the island and found more of these elusive geckos. This soon sparked the curiosity of herpetoculturists Philip de Vauchelet and Frank Fast, who visited the island on a voyage of discovery. They found thriving populations of geckos, mapped new distributions of species, rediscovered other Lazarus reptiles, and received permits to export some of these animals to the United States. Fast forward 3 decades, and the crested gecko is now one of the most popular pet reptiles in the world. Almost every crested gecko in captivity today descends from those first exports in the 1990s. So, we visited the ancestral home of the crested gecko to find and photograph the wild relatives of one of the world's most loved reptiles. New Caledonia is a French territory that sits about 900 miles off the east coast of Australia. It is an archipelago of over 140 islands. Grande Terre is the largest and most inhabited island, with the Loyalty Islands and the Isle of Pines also reasonably well connected to the main island. New Caledonia is comprised of various habitats, from vast mountain ranges reaching up to 1,500 metres above sea level to lowland evergreen forests, mackey shrubland and savanna. It is home to thousands of endemic species. In fact, 86% of New Caledonia's herpetofauna is found nowhere else in the world. 80% of the region's flora is also endemic, as well as a wide variety of bird species. New Caledonia is perhaps most famous for its marine life. A popular diving destination, New Caledonia has one of the largest barrier reefs in the world and is home to over a dozen species of sea snake, including the endemic New Caledonian sea crate. Its geological isolation has led to numerous cases of island gigantism, as New Caledonia hosts the world's largest geckos of the Rhacodactylus genus, as well as the enormous giant skinks of the genus Phoboscincus. Getting to New Caledonia isn't easy. There are limited flights from Paris, Brisbane, Auckland, Tokyo and Singapore. So we started the trip in Singapore to interview the team at Mandai Wildlife Reserve, check out Gardens by the Bay and enjoy a Singapore sling before the daunting task of finding a gecko that nobody had officially seen since the time of Charles Dickens. New Caledonia, here we come. So, with great expectations, we landed in Noumea, the capital city of New Caledonia. Our primary destination was the Isle of Pines, which is only around 50 miles squared. Visitors can access the island via plane, or in our case, ferry. However, that isn't easy in wet season, when cyclones cause almost every ferry to cancel that week. The water was choppy and the skies were grey, and we soon realised that this expedition was not going to be the idyllic island vacation that you see on the postcards. New Caledonia has 2 main seasons and intermediate months between. Dry season, or winter, is cooler and drier and runs from June to September, while summer, which is warmer and wetter and full of cyclones, runs from December to March. Reptiles are typically more active in the warmer, wetter months, so we embarked on our expedition through March. It wasn't long before we found our first gecko. It was day 1 in the early afternoon and she was around 3 meters from the ground. While conditions were reasonably sunny, although the UVI in that area was only 0.7 due to canopy and cloud cover, the idea that cresties are strictly nocturnal was blown out of the water immediately. Check this out, this is our first wild crested gecko of the expedition. She is a magnificent specimen. They're a little more drab than the ones in captivity, and she's actually seems to have suffered a little bit of trauma to her right eye. I think she's missing a toe and her tail as well. It's not uncommon for wild crested geckos to be missing their tails, but it looks like she's been through the wars. She's an old girl, you know, she's a good size, and we found her out here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, fully exposed, resting her body against the bark. So what that tells us about their sort of activity levels and the sort of conditions that they're exposed to is really quite interesting. They're definitely at least exposed to the elements during the day. They're not always sort of hiding away. So we're going to be taking environmental readings of this area, and we'll be able to tell you much more about how these crested geckos live in the wild. She is just beautiful. The first time I've ever seen a wild crested gecko. Finding our first crested gecko so early in the expedition meant we were looking in the right place. Now it was time to start dissecting the habitat to learn as much as we possibly can. The forest on the Isle of Pines is fragmented. Crested geckos occur in a few restricted populations on the Isle of Pines and in the southern province of New Caledonia, although one new population was discovered in the north in 2015. Whilst their range is small, it is varied and does fall into protected areas. Crested geckos are classified as vulnerable by the IUCN as they have a limited distribution, and invasive species such as ants and rodents pose a threat to some populations. Crested geckos live in tropical evergreen forests, and we used a plant identification app to ID the trees in the nearby area. Whilst there may be some disparities due to the immense endemism and uniqueness of New Caledonia flora, the app identified Australian red cedar, grey boxwood and eucalypts such as Australian tallow wood. So this is the forest that we were finding crested geckos in last night. It's slightly different to the habitat that we were finding them in a few days ago, and it's a lot sparser. There's a lot sort of less dense of a canopy. The trees are typically sort of thinner branches, things like this. They're scattered around everywhere. Unsurprisingly, the Isle of Pines also has various conifers and enormous ferns growing throughout. Crested geckos are unlikely to occur in these regions due to their diet preferences. But interestingly, some conifers were interspersed throughout the tropical forest habitat. The population we were assessing was found less than 50 meters from the shore in what could be considered as coastal forest. Here, the ground is made up of calcium-rich limestone and dead coral. In environments with high calcium content in the soil, plants typically carry more calcium too. This highlights the need for high calcium provisions within a complete diet. So now this is actually the area where crested geckos first came from. So those that actually came here and collected the first specimens said that they had the most success up here on this north coast. We had somewhat expected to find crested geckos most frequently on fig trees, which are very common in New Caledonia. However, this wasn't the case. And most of the geckos we spotted were found on yellow tulip trees, which had much thinner branches and also produced berries. So this is the forest where we have found the most crested geckos. We've noticed that crested geckos certainly seem to be more abundant in larger patches of forest. So where you're seeing anthropogenic sort of influence, sort of fragmented forests, you're not finding, or we're certainly not finding, the crested geckos. They are much better in this kind of pristine forest. I would imagine this is primary, and it's a large area that stretches across the sort of northeast part of the Isle of Pines. They certainly don't congregate in large numbers around fruiting trees. Instead, they move quite slowly. Again, probably an adaptation to the fact that they are nocturnal and they live in a reasonably temperate climate. You know, out here we're very rarely exceeding 26 degrees Celsius, which is quite cool. At night, obviously, it drops a little bit lower as well, not massively, But you know, for a reasonably large-bodied gecko to be moving around at 22 degrees Celsius, they need to be more sort of thoughtful and with their movements. It might be the case that predatory Leachianus geckos command control of the larger trees, so crested geckos must be opportunistic with their feeding and embrace the safety of the thinner branches. Spanish fig trees did offer another component to the diet in the form of insects. Decomposing figs would draw in small flying insects. Spiders would create complex web systems around the base of the tree where green-bellied tree skinks would bask and feed on the spiders and the larger insects. We noticed several differences between wild crested geckos and captive ones. Not only were the wild geckos more slender in their body structure, particularly around the skull, but they were also slimmer, which highlights the need for lower fat diets in captivity. We also noticed a lot of snails. Although their large size made them more noticeable than other invertebrates, they were highly abundant. Baby snails would also climb several meters off the ground, and one could safely assume that these calcium-rich superfoods may play an important role in the diets of wild geckos. They certainly do for the local people of New Caledonia. Crested geckos are considered nocturnal. While they are exposed in the day, we found all of our active individuals between the hours of 8 PM and 11 PM. Our search times ran from dusk at around 6 PM through to midnight. We averaged around 1 gecko every other night with 2 people searching. We also returned to the same location and searched heavily in areas where we found geckos previously to see if the geckos would remain in a particular territory. Take a look at this beautiful male crested gecko. He is a magnificent specimen. He's a really good size, a beautiful colour as well. More similar, I guess, to the ones that we find in captivity. He's in excellent condition. You can see those eyelashes are pointing up, really prominent. He's got this gorgeous broad head. We actually found him in a slightly different habitat, so we're trying to understand just what makes these crested geckos call their home. We did not find a single gecko twice, suggesting that they may move considerable distances through the understory or climb higher into the canopy when disturbed. Crested geckos are typically found in the understory layers just beneath the canopy. Here their white bellies can be easily spotted as they hunt for insects at night. Predatory giant geckos occupy the canopy higher up, and chameleon geckos, pelagic geckos and bovia species can be found further down. During our time on the Isle of Pines, temperature and humidity remained relatively stable. In fact, temperatures barely fluctuated more than 5 degrees Celsius and humidity was always more than 80%, rising to 95% at night. This was surprising as most tropical climates will still see a relatively significant temperature drop at night. During the winter months, this is probably more apparent, but in March, in the forest of the Isle of Pines, nights were warm and humid, and days only increased in temperature slightly, possibly due to the high cloud cover. On Grande Terre, things were slightly different. Clearer skies in the coastal areas meant the temperatures spiked up to 35 degrees Celsius and humidity would plummet to 50%. Here on the west coast of Grande Terre, the environmental conditions are very different to the Isle of Pines and Blue River Provincial Park. Now it's a beautiful clear day today and the UVI is, well, it was 4 this morning and it's increasing throughout the day. I think it's about 6 or 7 now. And the temperature, we're looking at 34 degrees Celsius with a humidity of 55%. So it's completely different to the places that we were finding crested geckos. I mean, New Caledonia is actually one of the least populated places in the world. So there's a concentration of people in Noumea in the city and also these coastal towns just outside of Noumea. And that means that a lot of the data that we're receiving in, abroad is actually not the same sort of environmental conditions that these crested geckos live in. In fact, crested geckos on Isle of Pines and the crested geckos in the higher elevations of New Caledonia, in places like Blue River Provincial Park and the foothills of Mount Dusmok, are going to experience very different conditions to this beautiful sunshine that we've finally seen on the last few days of the expedition. We've been exploring the exact locations where Corallophus ciliatus are found, and it might have just been our luck, but it was not this beautiful, pristine sort of weather that we're experiencing now. It's something that people need to consider at home. It's something we can use this data and we can find ways of caring for and finding good, strong averages when we think about reptile husbandry. But trying to find the exact precise data and having that data over the course of a year as well is going to cause challenges. We've only been in Coralophus ciliatus habitat for 14 days, and we've got that data, and it was in the middle of wet season, and it's important to sort of use that and analyze it. But we can't necessarily make assumptions about the way that we keep crested geckos based on data from all over this actually rather large island. New Caledonia might be something that we don't hear of very often in the West. On Grande Terre, crested geckos are found in forests near mountain ranges that may collect more cloud cover and thus experience slightly higher humidity and rainfall than other areas on the island. So the cloud cover is immense. It covers everything. It's really quite grey. The UVI rarely exceeds 0.6 while we've been here anyway. We've had 2 hours of sunshine last week, and that's we recorded UVI of 11. So it's actually very difficult to understand exactly what kind of conditions these crested geckos are exposed to. But what we do know is that seasonality is a really, really important aspect of their sort of natural behaviours. It is therefore important to assess the exact microhabitats of reptiles and amphibians before assuming their climatic needs based on meteorological data. Of course, we couldn't visit New Caledonia without a trip to Blue River Provincial Park, but in typical herping fashion, the rainy season had other ideas. So we're at Blue River Provincial Park, and unfortunately we can't get in. This is the third time we've tried. The rain just hasn't stopped, and they're not letting any visitors in at the minute. It's causing floods, it's causing problems with the landscape and dangers to visitors. So it's a bit of a shame, but we can see from this map just what Blue River looks like. So you can see the geckos definitely aren't a secret here. There are crested geckos here. This is one of only 2 populations on Grande Terre where they're found. The population of crested geckos in Blue River Provincial Park is poorly studied and potentially sparser than that on the Isle of Pines. The park spans 54,000 acres across various altitudes and habitats, making herping far more difficult. Instead, we camped up just outside the park in the Upper Yate Fauna Reserve, in prime habitat for gargoyle geckos. This medium altitude maquis shrubland has been the focal point of various research missions into Rhacodactylus auriculatus over the years. Unfortunately, dangerous hiking conditions, floods and rivers of red clay limited our ability to search. It did, however, give us some great insight into the wild habitats of gargoyle geckos and the stark difference between these and the habitats of crested geckos. After nearly 3 weeks of non-stop rain, the sun finally came out for our last 2 days in New Caledonia, where we had time to reflect on the expedition. So we've been camping just outside of Blue River Provincial Park for the last 3 nights now, and we've driven alongside the park. The park is enormous. We've entered the first part of the park, but the access point for visitors has unfortunately been closed for the last few days. This is because of a lot of rainfall. There's been basically non-stop rain for the last 3 days. It's been grey skies pretty much since we arrived in New Caledonia. There's been rain at least every hour. And up here in the higher elevations where Blue River Park is, it catches that cloud cover, and it's almost non-stop fine rain all day through most of the night. And yeah, it's been particularly, I don't know, well, it seems like it's been particularly bad the last few days because they've closed the park completely. That rain is obviously causing rivers and streams to flood. It's causing, you know, rocks to dislodge on some of these cliff faces that the park's well known for, and yeah, it's creating a health hazard, and unfortunately we can't bypass that very easily. The crested gecko, despite being one of the most popular lizards in captivity, is one that is poorly studied. The disconnect between captive and wild specimens is stark, and we are proud to be able to bridge the gap between the two and showcase these wonderful lizards in the wild.